Things are more expensive than they have ever been, and although the media says inflation is supposedly going down, the question for the average person is, does it matter if inflation goes down slightly after it's been rising out of control for multiple years on end?
While inflation is off the highs of 2022, monthly budget items have continued to soar. Rent was up 6.2% last year, auto insurance skyrocketed 20%, and dining out jumped 5.2%.
Prices in some cases have doubled, tripled, or quadrupled. If you look at the cost of plywood right now, you'll know what I mean. It doesn't matter if inflation drops by 10% when we've had a 300 or 400% increase over the last 3 years. It's still unaffordable as because at the end of the day, a drop in price doesn't matter unless people are able to live better because of it. So here's a walk down memory lane, comparing what a middle-class lifestyle looked like in the 50s, in the 80s, and today, as well as what an average family has to make in 2024 to live the same middle-class lifestyle that a family in the 1950s or even in the 1980s was able to enjoy on basic to-earner incomes working normal middle-class jobs. Because just how far we have fallen and how little $100,000 will actually change your life, that's how much money this is, it's gonna surprise you. So let's go back in time. The year is 1950. The Korean War has just begun, and also beginning is America's addiction to war. Credit cards were invented this year, cheaper by the dozen, the original was released, and the median income for an average family was just $3,000 for the entire year. Just think about the fact that an entire family could be supported on just $3,000 for 12 months. And it's also worth noting that in the 1950s, this income was usually brought in by a single working man, while mom stayed home, raising the kids and making up the house. But today, if you're making $3,000 a month as a single adult, you're barely surviving in most major US cities. But times were simpler in the 1950s because that was enough to get you into the middle class, baby. And here's what your 1950s middle class lifestyle would cost you. A home only cost $7,354 and mortgage payments were only $47 a month. A new car was $1,500. Gas was 24 cents a gallon. Milk was 83 cents a gallon. A loaf of bread was 14 cents. Sirloin steak cost 77 cents per pound. And we'll compare what the standard of living back then was to modern man in a moment, because our ancestors lived in a totally different way than we do today. But in order to compare apples to oranges, we gotta go to the 1980s, because without the 80s to bridge the gap between where we are now, paying for $1,000,000 starter homes, and where we began in the 1950s, where a home was only $7,000, we gotta look at the 80s as the bridge to modern inflation. Because in 1980, the average family brought in $21,000 a year, which is 7 times greater than what the average family made in 1950. A new home cost $47,000, 6.3 times more than the house from the 1960s. So when compared to the 1950s, Americans' earning power was increasing faster than inflation was. So if you were in your prime earning years in the 1980s, you got to enjoy peak prosperity in the West. Maximum bang for your buck, toys, vacations, time off. You got to invest money all on an average salary. Because also in 1980, a brand new car only cost $7,000, gas was $1.19, milk $1.29, a loaf of bread was 50 cents, and a sirloin steak cost $1.83 per pound. But peak prosperity in the 1980s wasn't what it seemed, because even though the earning power of the median household in this decade actually increased relative to inflation on the surface, below the surface, a fundamental American value had to be sacrificed to make all that happen: the stay-at-home mom. The 1980s was the beginning of female empowerment, which was a narrative that cleverly got women out of the home to help maintain their family's standard of living, because inflation was already starting to eat into the lifestyle of Americans. But women stepped up, earning alongside their partners, and on the surface, it looked like Americans were still increasing in prosperity. But under the surface, the country's currency was rotting away. But why are prices rising, and why do things get more expensive over time anyway? Why couldn't they just stay constant? Well, the answer is they could, but they don't, because of a growing federal government. You see, the government in the United States is the largest organization to ever exist in the history of planet Earth, and they don't produce anything. All of the money that they spend on programs and pay themselves in the government has to come from money that's taken in the form of taxes from citizens who are actually working for their money. But even taxpayers don't make enough money to support the system of government that has now ballooned to titanic proportions. Remember what happened to the Titanic? So now, when the government needs money and the tax base can't support it, the government just borrows the money from themselves. And they do this by printing more of it. And since wages in the United States and the UK aren't tied to inflation, the government is in a roundabout way borrowing value from people who hold cash. It's all sort of a hidden tax that benefits financially irresponsible government and drives up the cost of living for their citizens who save their money in the bank, watching it become less and less valuable before their very eyes because their government can't balance their own books. So what all this means is that prices aren't actually rising. It's the value of the currency that you hold that's actually decreasing as your government destroys the value of it for you. Because in 2024, the numbers get pretty crazy. The median household income today is $74,000, usually made by two earners in a home. And today, the average cost of a new home in the United States is $387,000. A brand new car on average costs $47,000. Gas is $3 a gallon, milk is $4.27, bread is now $3.29, and a sirloin steak is $10 per pound. But it's not just prices that are stratospheric right now. So is the amount of money that you need to make every year in order to just be middle class. Because back in 1950, a household made $3,300 a year. The cost to buy a new home and car combined was $8,850, meaning you could buy a home and a car back then for 2.5 times your annual income. But today, a home and a car together costs $434,000, which is 5.8 times the annual income of an average person. Which means, in order to live a middle-class lifestyle similar to the average American family in the 1950s or the 1980s, you need to make $173,000 a year. $173,000 a year is true middle class in the United States if you want to keep pace with inflation and maintain the same standard of living from middle-class family from 1950 or 1980. So now that we're here and we see the situation for what it really is, let's give an honorable mention and moment of silence maybe for all of the professions that no longer qualify as middle class, even if both people in a household have jobs in these positions. Teachers, janitors, bus drivers, retail managers, police, firefighters, nurses, medical assistants, accountants, store clerks, truck drivers, cashiers, food prep, waiters, waitresses, customer service, maids, housekeepers. So the question really is this: what are things gonna look like in the United States and the United Kingdom in another 30 years when a starter house is $2 million, when rent for a small apartment is $5,500 a month, and wages have barely risen? What does that world look like? Let me know in the comments, and maybe we make a video on that next.